This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern.
And I'm Yael Barda.
Every week we bring you conversations with authors about their books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we simply cannot thank you enough. Our guest today is a professor of international studies and history and a distinguished endowed chair of Jewish studies at the University of Washington in Seattle. She's currently a Resnick Fellow at the National Library of Israel. She specializes in the history of Israel and Palestine, more specifically the history of early Zionism, which is also the subject of her latest book, The Oldest Guard, Forging the Zionist Settler Past, that was published in 2021 by Stanford University Press. Professor Liora Halperin, hello and welcome back to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, and thank you for having me back.
So your book belongs to probably my favorite kind of history books. It is at once a work of history, shedding light on a bygone past, and an inquiry into the creation of collective memory. And I hope we're going to spend much of the next 45 minutes discussing the interplay between these two. But let's start by laying out this specific chapter in Zionist history that it tackles, a somewhat forgotten chapter, and forgotten is a key word here, of course, the agricultural settlements that were built in the late 19th and early 20th centuries during what is generally called the first Aliyah. What were they, and what distinguishes them from the rest of Zionist history?
Thank you. So what's known in Israel and to the historiography of Zionism as the first Aliyah is a period that is typically dated to between 1882 and 1904, in which a number, in fact, a very small number of Jewish agricultural settlers acted to purchase lands, initially outside of Jaffa and in the Galilee, to form agricultural colonies in which Jews could become productive. So the idea of engaging in agricultural labor came out of Haskalah ideas that Jews needed to leave urban centers, engage in productive labor, specifically agriculture. Some of the very first attempts to do that came not from folks who had recently gotten off the boat in Jaffa, but folks who already had been settled for some years or even generations in the cities of Palestine, in Tzfat and in Jerusalem, who decided to experiment with moving into the rural areas and taking up agricultural settlement. But really, what's known as the first Aliyah came to be associated with a small cohort of the wave of Jewish settlers who came to Palestine in the late 19th century, who began this process of acquiring agricultural lands for settlement. And there's a lot more to say about it, of course, but that's just place it in time and place it in space.
Yeah, but even more interestingly is how they are distinguished from the following Aliyahs.
That's right. So, why is it even called the first Aliyah? So there's, even in this term itself, it's worth unpacking it to understand, what's going on. So, first of all, the fact that it's referred to as first is highly significant, right? It marks out this particular kind of migration, Jewish migration to Palestine, from the migration that had happened before, because these folks were not the first to move to and settle within Palestine. There had been communities, mainly urban ones, certainly as far back as the post-Spanish expulsion period, and some say that it was ongoing before that too, right? So to say first is to say, okay, something began here that then, in retrospect, comes to shape the development of the Zionist settlement project. But at the same time, right, you would think that the first, has the crown of honor of not only is it first, but somehow it's best or most noble. But in fact, the term first Aliyah was created funded not by the folks who were actually engaged in these experiments in rural settlement, but by a later wave of Jewish arrivals who arrived in the first couple decades of the 20th century, motivated by ideals of socialism and collectivism, supported by the, at that point, quite new Zionist movement, who saw themselves as really the vanguard, right? They wanted to take up a new model of Jewish productive labor, namely one that would not be reliant on native Palestinian labor. So they looked at this cohort of folks who had already engaged in these experiments and saw them really as quite backward and on the wrong course, right? Good idea, but you're doing it all wrong. And so this group that called themselves the Second Aliyah, very closely associated with labor Zionism and its rise to power, effectively named their predecessors in order to mark them as conservative, backwards, right, uncommitted to Jewish revival, etc. So there's this very complicated, right, sort of the crown of firstness, and also marked from the beginning as lesser or more backwards than what came later.
You write about the differences between the treatment of Arab labor between the first and second Aliyah, and I think that's a very illuminating issue. And you have this great chapter that's called Arab Labor and the Rhetoric of Hierarchical Coexistence in Mandate Palestine, which is already further down, in terms of the timeline. But could you tell us a little bit about this chapter and how you perceive it as creating institutions and culture that then remain within Israeli society?
Absolutely. So an important thing to say about my book is, although I've introduced a particular period of history as, right, the one that I am interested in fact, the book is not about that period. So there's something a bit kind of idiosyncratic that I always have to explain when I talk about my book. So, of course, I lay out some of the historical narrative of that period.
Yeah, as you're right, I mean, the settlements of the first Aliyah actually outlived the first Aliyah. So that's the whole point. Yeah.
That's right. So these models of, privately owned agriculture, kind of outside or uncomfortably related to the Zionist movement, persist. And in fact, what my book looks at is not so much kind of retell the story of the 1880s or 1890s, but to look at what happens within the communities that were founded in those decades, some of which became quite prosperous and large, especially the ones in the Jaffa area, like Petah Tikva and Rishon LeZion and Rehovot. I'm looking at how people within those communities, often sons, grandsons, family members of those founders, told a story about that past, right? What did they want their own children or folks around them without that lineage to know about that period and those people? What did they believe had been misunderstood? And so this gets to your question, Yael, about one very important component of that story that they wanted told. And that is they had come to be associated since really the arrival of these labor Zionist ideologues with the fact of them hiring villagers from local Palestinian villages to do the manual labor, or much of it, or most of it, in their colonies at the beginning. Right? This was a source of incredible opprobrium from the labor Zionist camp. In retrospect, though, what I find in the anniversary celebrations, in the publications, in the school curriculum, right, in the sort of sources I find from the 30s and 40s and even into the 50s and 60s, is that they wanted to reframe that story, right? Instead of Arab labor, as it was known, being framed as, the wrong way to go or backwards or destructive, right? They wanted to talk about the positive relations that they had with their Arab employees, and to talk about, right, the fact that those relations were so good and in fact had declined because of the rise of labor Zionists to power, who didn't understand the value of these relationships. And these relationships, as the title of my chapter makes clear, were explicitly, right, structurally hierarchical, right? Jewish landowners and employers hiring villagers, right, dependent on wage income, often kind of recently transitioned from older forms of land work and ownership to wage income, very much dependent within this new economy. Very much, in most cases, inclined to kind of get along with their employers. And those employers saw those relationships and says, I remember Ahmed and I remember Muhammad, I remember, Fathi, whoever it is who's working for me. And there's nostalgia about that. And there's a sense that this ideological commitment to 100% Hebrew labor, which unfortunately is never fully implemented even by labor Zionists, in fact had undermined something important. And you asked about how this persists into later history. And a point I make as I go through the book, and then in my conclusion, which kind of brings things more into the present, is that this sensibility about Palestinian labor absolutely persists. And it goes through different eras. After 48, when a minority of Palestinians are incorporated as citizens of Israel. And then again after 67, when Israel captures, this large population, many of them refugees in the West Bank and Gaza, and incorporates them as this captive labor force again and again. And until today, and perhaps listeners will be familiar with this, folks talking about the very good relations they have with the individual person or particular village, and say, if only things could happen outside of politics, outside of ideology, everything would be fine, while obscuring the structural hierarchy and the power dynamics that made that possible in the past and then in different ways make it possible in the present.
Yeah, this is just one manifestation of this very interesting power relations between that cohort that you focus on and the relationship with the ever-growing and more powerful labor Zionism, as an establishment in the Zionist movement, in the Yishuv, and then in the State of Israel. How maybe we can say more generally how they really tried, maybe in terms of politics and even sort of like public relations, try to carve out their place in the history of the Yishuv.
Yeah, and that's a very central question for me, and it required me looking at a lot of different kinds of sources, because one thing to say about these private landowners, and I didn't quite mention before that there's this distinction, really until today, between lands under private ownership and lands under collective or Zionist ownership, These folks had purchased lands as private purchasers as opposed to the lands that would be purchased by the Jewish National Fund that would become the basis for, Jewish national lands. So how do they advocate for themselves? Well, the first thing to say is that they don't do a very good job of actually integrating into the emerging political systems of the Yishuv or the State of Israel. And they're always complaining about that. Some of them do, in fact, get involved in national politics. More commonly, they become involved in municipal politics. So a lot of mayors of these colonies, and the word is moshavot, which was a direct translation of colonies. So often the mayors of these moshavot for decades came from these early families or the councils of these cities or regions. But they didn't do a great job of really carving out a place in national politics, although they constituted an important piece of what we might now call the Zionist political center. And it went through some different party iterations. Ultimately, that kind of capitalist, private-owning class actually became part of Likud, was a very important piece of Likud when Likud was founded in 1973. So what do they do to try to, in the absence of this really strong political apparatus, they try to act in their professional capacities. So some of them are involved with cooperatives around the marketing of either citrus or wine grapes, which are the two really big industries. So they try to advocate for economic policies that are going to benefit them. But from the memory standpoint, the commemorative standpoint, they try lots of different things. So I looked at the way that they try to individuals or communities try to promote school curriculum that'll tell those stories, writing little books or pamphlets that they hope will be distributed, especially locally, right, to kids growing up in these moshavot from that era, asking them to work on school assignments or write essays in honor of those anniversaries. And I found amazing, handwritten 7th grade essays from Lechovot from, 1960 or 1970, right? What did those kids write? What were they expected to understand or repeat? They also, really until the 60s, when that first generation pretty much by that point had died, those elderly folks were often brought in to speak to school groups, or more often school groups took field trips to visit some of the kind of old guard. And my book has a double entendre here, some of whom were actually old guards on horseback and some of whom were simply an old guard, right, to tell their stories and impress upon the vast majority of the Jewish population who were newer immigrants, sort of what it was to be in this generation. They try to engage in commemoration that's going to go beyond the local, right, by inviting folks from outside, initially the British and folks from other parts of the Yishuv, and then after 48, trying to work within the Israeli apparatus to kind of bring people into this story. So a lot of different, let's say, like spheres of activity.
So there's one point that I thought was really interesting, and it's going back a little bit to the era itself, of this thing about showing the British that they are capable, and showing the British that that actually the security situation is not that terrible, and that they can sustain themselves, and also that they were kind of these beacons of development. And, and there have been other books like Land of Progress and some others that have pointed to this kind of, kind of forging the narrative that basically the Jewish Aliyah can bring this place to development, whereas, Palestinians and others cannot. And I was very interested in that aspect because I recognize in it even something that we hear today, that in the sense of who can promote development or who can promote progress, and it was just fascinating to read.
Yeah, thank you. I think in that way, my book also is kind of part of an emerging set of books and research that is thinking about the capitalist development of Palestine. Right, there's such a domination by like labor Zionism in the historiography that only in the last couple of decades are we seeing kind of looking at these capitalist actors. And right, so people like Laura Robson or Frederick Mayton, Shireen Sekeli, looking at Palestinian businessmen, they are trying to angle to a position of influence with the British. And the British are very interested as, right, colonizers, but within this mandate context, to kind of outsource the development to this group who has presented itself as eager, in fact, to engage in the economic development. So towards the British, it was very important for the Zionist movement as a whole, but particularly folks whose capitalist activity was really the essence of what they were doing, to point out how effective they were at growing the economy. So when you look at communications with the British, or maybe more fun, some of the sort of ceremonial opportunities that these colonies had to bring in the High Commissioner or some other official to kind of show off the agricultural undertakings, to say, look, the vast majority of the Jewish economy, and they weren't wrong about this, under the mandate, was being generated by private owners, whether that was agriculture and then later on industry, and say, okay, these kibbutzim talk a big game about the collective and all this, but they're a symbol, right? Or they're symbolic, or they're marginal in terms of economic capacity. And they're constantly trying to present themselves as sort of the right-hand people to the colonial enterprise that the British are doing.
And now beyond the political and perhaps economic aspects of that, what about like looking at it from a social history perspective? Are these really is the early iteration of the Israeli bourgeoisie or Zionist bourgeoisie, if you can even say that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's one important component of that emerging capitalist class. Right? Sometimes there's a kind of simple narrative of Israel's story, which is that it was under socialist control. And then in 1977, Likud takes power. And then there's an era of neoliberal politics or liberalization of the economy. Of course, that's true on a macro level, but there always were folks who were kind of pushing for more room for private enterprise. And these folks were chronologically speaking, the earliest group to be invested, right, personally interested in there being more room or more space for private initiative, right, less control by these centralized institutions like the Histadrut or, company like Solel Bone and all these companies that are kind of consolidating the development. I don't think, right, there weren't that many of them, so it would be wrong to say like they are the constituents of it, but I think symbolically and historically they're a very important like point on that journey.
And what about the urban bourgeoisie?
Right.
What was the interplay between the
Right.
Moshavot? People were advocating for private enterprise, etc., in the Moshavot and in, Tel Aviv.
Absolutely. And I think, right, this is also an important thing that came out of my research is just how many folks who become central in, right, the urban bourgeoisie got their start or had some kind of role or maybe continued to own lands in the agricultural colonies. Dizengoff, for example, the mayor of Tel Aviv, right, had his era working, I think it was Yichron Yaakov. Right. So, and then we forget that some of these moshavot become cities in their own right. So, right, they don't have to move to become part of an urban bourgeoisie. In fact, the urban bourgeoisie develops as this colony develops into and is recognized as a city.
One of the very difficult things that we're experiencing in these last months is that there's this real resistance to even speak about colonial history or the viewpoint of Israel as a settler colony, or what is the relationship between the national project and the settlement project. And all these things that we know as sociologists and historians that we cannot understand history without. And yet there's this real fear. It's like an aversion from speaking about this. Do you have any, can you share with us your experience of navigating these waters? And also, do you have any ways to understand this?
Sure. Yeah, that's another component that we haven't yet talked about, which is my engagement with the field of settler colonial theory in trying to think about and contextualize, understand these mechanisms of memory in these agricultural colonies. And I'll say that when I first began working on this project, which was around 2014 or 2015, I wasn't really steeped in that discourse of, Zionism is settler colonial. I didn't start with that frame, right? I came to it in a much more organic way, which is that I was trying to see what kind of literature existed on a memory about settlement in places where what is being remembered is an act of settlement and all the challenges related to it. And very, very quickly, I discovered that much of the literature on that topic dealt with mainly Anglo-American, but not only, settlement, within what was then kind of the emerging or growing field of settler colonial studies. And I never thought about that connection before. And all of a sudden I thought, wow, there are insights here, right? What does it mean for somebody or a community to come and establish a agricultural community in a place that's new to them and encountering the challenges of climate and hostile natives and persevering and forging ahead, right? A lot of that typologically is precisely what's being remembered. And so for me, it was quite natural and organic to keep going down that road and see what some of the nuances of that research are, what kind of terms, what kind of frameworks would help me understand, right? This is not memory of war casualties, right? There's a different literature about remembering the dead in war, right? It's not the memory of like the fathers of the nation, right? In many ways, Zionism is an ethno-national, revival movement. And that helps us explain a lot, but it doesn't fully help us explain the settlement component, which is not key to most of the comparison cases of national movements. And so I think in a very natural way, I came to see the ways that this growing body of literature can help us understand this very formative piece of Zionism, which is ityashvut, settlement. And sometimes I'm a bit befuddled by like the discourse around this, where there's sometimes incomprehensible to me sense that places that are nationalist in origin are somehow good, are okay, and places that are settler colonial in origin are somehow bad and to be done away with. I mean, the history of nationalism is incredibly brutal and horrific. Nothing great. Well, I don't say nothing great. There are good things about it, but I don't think it's obvious which one comes out on top. And I think in most cases, right, you need to understand the interplay of national sentiment and settler colonial sentiment. In this case, certainly above all. So, in writing this book and then in speaking about this book over the years, as this concept has become more and more present in the public discourse, I find myself trying to shed light and not heat to say, here's how we can think about these concepts working in tandem in particular contexts. And first and foremost, the one that I study, which is in the history of, Zionism and Jewish settlement in Palestine.
What do you think remains of the legacy today? I mean, on the one hand, with the decline of labor Zionism in the last decades, it ostensibly should have given them much more room to express themselves and, a revival of that current within Zionism. On the other, I mean, you were talking about how they were a component in the early Likud in the 1970s, like the liberal capitalist sort of wing of Likud that was very, very powerful and is now all but defunct. Then again, there's the rise of the center in Israeli politics, but that, for some observers, including myself, it often came at the expense of the slightly left of center component within Israeli politics. Where do you see the descendants of that current in Zionism placed today?
Yeah, I think you're right to place it in the center, this like muddled area full of people who think of themselves as not political, which is so key, right? Folks who either don't want to engage in politics or do it begrudgingly, or folks who believe that economic activity can be or is outside the realm of politics. I certainly see some of the legacies in some of the efforts that Israel or Israeli businesses take to kind of promote Israel through the lens of business, right? Like the angle of Hasbara that's all about business. Like, let's look at these advancements in technology or irrigation or desalination of water, and imagine...
Or the disconki.
Or the what?
The disconki.
Or the disconki, or the cherry tomato, yeah. Right? Or the cherry tomatoes, right? To imagine that kind of that could or should win admiration for Israel, like outside of politics. Right? Why are folks talking about politics when they could talk about these other things? So that, I think, is a really interesting through line. Kind of imagining, and this is, I contend, like not just me contends, like a fantasy from the beginning that economics is in fact detached from whether politics or structural relations of power. But in any case, really interesting through line of kind of thinking about economic activity as not political. I think there's also this interesting way that the center is fuzzy, right? So the center can be and has been allied directly with the much more militant right. It also has been allied with Mapai and the Labor Zionist Center. Sometimes aspects of these stories that I chronicle from the 1930s into the 1960s pop up again, which is, the far right, the extremists, want to do away with the Arabs, or at least that's part of the rhetoric, right? We have this more moderate view that's based on as I call it, hierarchical coexistence. We have gotten along, we can get along. That's too extreme. Let's just maintain these relationships of power in a way that, quote unquote, works for everyone. Now, whether it does work for everyone, it's a different question. So, for example, Ruby Rivlin, who comes from a kind of a Likud background, but often is speaking about Jewish Arab or Jewish Palestinian relations in a way that often strikes observers as almost leftist in nature, speaks to some of the instability of this kind of political location.
Do you think there is also a strand of memory that is about finding possibilities of living together in this kind of fraught reality, even at this moment? And if so, how would you say people are drawing those lines and connections? And I don't even know, I'm not exactly sure how. So it's about this chapter, which I really recommend, even if you're not going to read the whole book, this thing about Arab labor on the hierarchical social structure. I found it so illuminating and to help understand this kind of institutional separation. And so how do you think that is deployed or can be deployed even at this terrible moment?
I think the answer is yes. I think if you look at a lot of what's being published in our field, broadly speaking, a lot of it is about looking back to the past for untold pieces of the story with some hope to find something that's usable in the present, right? That something is fundamentally or became over time, depending on your view, fundamentally broken. And maybe if we look backwards, we can find something. I'm skeptical about the position that hierarchical existence can in fact be coexistence in a harmonious sense, right? So I'm skeptical, right? I'm not of that mindset myself, but I really understand how, let's say, realist it is and how it seems, right, societies for the most part, right, tend to be to some extent hierarchical in their structure. Right? Would I rather there be a hierarchical structure that is relatively better for everyone involved versus relatively worse for everyone involved? Of course I would. And so on some level, I can understand, even if I don't agree with the folks who look at that and say, yes, it seems pragmatic to offer folks jobs and see that as a pathway towards some kind of stability. But on another level, I think, and this is where the settler colonial kind of theory comes in, which is the very premise that one can sort of set up shop in a rural space, having not had a background in that space, and create that hierarchical structure and have it work out for everyone, disregards, right, the fundamentals of what it means to come and settle and to change the economic structure of a place and make certain people dependent on you who had not been dependent on you before. And time and again, and this is where the comparative work is so important, even if it seems to be working for a while, right, it produces resistance over time. And that resistance can come in lots of forms, and it can be violent, but it also can be political or nonviolent protest, but it happens, right? And so as time has told, right, it happened in this case too. And I don't think that if, right, this model of the Moshavot had persisted over the long term, everything would be hunky-dory, as they say, right? It would have produced resistance of its own, but it would have been different, and perhaps it could have been then resolved in a different way with those relationships already intact and present.
All right, Professor Leora Halperin, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And many thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios. And now we've got a request, because many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. Good, bad, ugly, up to you. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto a Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has probably close to 1,000 interviews by now, if not more. Like us on Facebook, follow me and Yael on Twitter, and most important, join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from us here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.